Why Nat Turner risked everything for freedom. Nat Turner did not wake up one day and decide to become one of the most feared men in American history for no reason. He was born into a world where black people were treated as property, where human beings could be bought, sold, whipped, broken, and killed under a system that called itself lawful. But what made Nat Turner different was not just that he suffered under slavery. It was that he refused to believe slavery was natural, permanent, or acceptable. If you love powerful, forgotten history like this, follow this channel now, because the truth they tried to bury is exactly what we bring to light. Nat Turner was born enslaved in Southampton County, Virginia, in 1800, and from a young age, people around him noticed there was something unusual about him. He was highly intelligent, deeply spiritual, and often withdrawn, spending time reading the Bible and thinking about the meaning of suffering, justice, and freedom. In a world where enslaved people were often denied education, Nat Turner learned to read, and that alone was dangerous because knowledge gave him language, memory, and a way to understand the chains around him. The slave system depended not only on physical force, but on mental control. It wanted enslaved people to believe they were powerless, chosen for bondage, and meant to serve forever. But Nat Turner's mind became a battlefield, and in that battlefield he began to reject everything slavery demanded of him. He saw the cruelty around him. He saw black families torn apart, women violated, children sold, men beaten, and souls crushed. He saw a system built not only on labor, but on terror. And unlike those who tried to survive by staying silent, Nat Turner came to believe that silence itself was another kind of death. To understand why he risked everything, you have to understand that for many enslaved people, life under slavery was already a constant risk. There was no safety in obedience. A slave could be whipped for speaking, punished for reading, sold for disobedience, or murdered without justice. There was no guaranteed peace in submission. So when people ask why Nat Turner risked his life, the deeper question is this: what kind of life was he expected to preserve? A life without freedom, without rights, without ownership of his own body, family, time, or future, was not a full life to him. It was captivity, and captivity had to be challenged. Turner believed he was chosen by God for a mission. Today, some people see that as religious extremism. Others see it as spiritual resistance. But whatever one thinks, it was central to how he understood his purpose. He experienced visions and signs that he interpreted as divine instructions, and in his mind he was not simply acting out of anger, but out of duty. He believed that if evil ruled through slavery, then resistance was righteous. That belief gave him courage in a world designed to crush courage. It gave him a reason to move beyond fear, because fear is what slavery fed on. Fear kept plantations running. Fear kept people from running, rebelling, speaking, organizing, or hoping. Nat Turner crossed the line that the slave system most feared. He chose not to be ruled by fear anymore. In August 1831, he led one of the most famous slave rebellions in American history. Along with a group of enslaved and free black men, he launched an uprising aimed at striking back against the slaveholding system in Southampton County. Their plan was violent, and that violence remains deeply debated to this day. But what cannot be ignored is the world that created it. Slave revolts did not rise from nowhere. They were born from years of brutality, dehumanization, theft, and pain. Nat Turner did not create violence in Virginia. Slavery did. The lash, the auction block, the rape of enslaved women, the sale of children, the denial of humanity, all of that was violence long before Turner raised a hand in resistance. That does not erase the horror of what happened during the revolt, but it forces history to be honest about cause and effect. Turner believed freedom would never be handed to the enslaved through kindness or gradual change. He believed it would have to be seized. That is why he risked everything. He knew the odds were against him. He knew capture likely meant death. He knew that if the revolt failed, the punishment would be terrible, not just for him, but for many black people in the region. And yet he moved forward. That tells you something powerful about his state of mind. He had reached the point where the possibility of dying for freedom felt more meaningful than living forever in chains. That is not recklessness. That is what oppression can produce when human beings are pushed beyond what they can bear. After the rebellion, white Southern fear exploded. Slave patrols intensified. Brutal reprisals followed, and laws became even harsher. Enslaved people faced even tighter control, and many innocent black people paid the price for the terror that slaveholders felt. Nat Turner was eventually captured, tried, and executed. But even in death, he became something the slave system could never fully destroy. He became a symbol. To slaveholders, he was a nightmare. To many enslaved people and later generations, he became proof that resistance was possible, that fear could be broken, and that even in the darkest conditions, the desire for freedom could not be completely buried. His rebellion shook the South because it shattered the lie that enslaved people were content or naturally submissive. It exposed the truth that beneath the surface of forced labor and plantation order was a deep and constant hunger for liberation. Nat Turner risked everything because he believed that a life lived in chains was an insult to God, to human dignity, and to the soul itself. He believed freedom was worth more than comfort, more than safety, more than survival under oppression. Whether people agree with his methods or not, history cannot deny the force behind his decision. He was not simply a man who rebelled. He was a man pushed by a system so cruel that revolt became, in his mind, the only honest answer left. And that is why Nat Turner still matters today. He reminds us that freedom has always had a price, and that behind every polished version of American history lies a harder truth. That some of the people this country tried hardest to silence were the very ones brave enough to demand that human beings should never be owned at all. Nat Turner's story did not end at the gallows, and that is what makes his rebellion so powerful even now, because the body can be killed while the message keeps moving through time. After his execution in 1831, white America tried to turn him into a warning, a symbol of what would happen to any enslaved person who dared to imagine freedom through force. But something else happened too. He became proof that the enslaved were not passive victims waiting quietly for mercy. They were thinking, feeling, remembering, planning human beings who understood exactly what slavery was doing to them. For years, many slaveholders had comforted themselves with the lie that enslaved people were loyal, childlike, and incapable of organized resistance. Nat Turner destroyed that fantasy in one bloody night. He revealed that beneath the forced smiles, the bowed heads, and the daily labor was a world of hidden rage, hidden prayer, hidden grief, and hidden hope. That is one reason his rebellion terrified the South so deeply. It was not only the violence of the uprising that frightened white slaveholders. It was the realization that the people they claimed to own had inner lives they could never fully control. Turner showed them that a man could be physically chained and still mentally free enough to dream of overthrowing the entire system. And once that fear entered the minds of slave owners, it never fully left. In the months and years after the revolt, Southern states tightened laws even more. Enslaved people were watched more closely. Black gatherings were restricted. Education was cracked down on harder, and any sign of independent thought became suspicious. Why? Because literacy, faith, memory, and community were dangerous to slavery. Slaveholders understood something important, even if they hated admitting it. Freedom often begins in the mind before it appears in the world. That is why Nat Turner's ability to read, interpret scripture, and inspire others mattered so much. He was not dangerous simply because he carried out a revolt. He was dangerous because he believed enslaved people were meant for more than bondage and because he convinced others to believe it too. That kind of belief can outlive chains, prisons, and executions. It can pass from one generation to another. It can become history, then memory, then movement. And in many ways, that is exactly what happened. Nat Turner became part of a long tradition of black resistance in America, a tradition that included rebellion, escape, storytelling, legal challenge, spiritual survival. He was not the only one who fought slavery, but he became one of its most unforgettable symbols because he forced the nation to confront what it had built. America liked to speak about liberty, independence, and human rights, but slavery exposed a deep contradiction at the heart of the country. How could a nation celebrate freedom while millions were held in chains? Nat Turner's revolt did not just challenge slaveholders in Virginia. It challenged the moral image America had created for itself. It forced people to see that slavery was not some unfortunate side issue in the nation's history. It was one of its foundations, soaked into its laws, wealth, politics, and social order. Turner's rebellion pulled the mask off that reality. That is why his name still sparks discomfort. He does not fit neatly into safe history. He is not easy to turn into a simple hero or villain without losing the truth of what made him who he was. He lived inside a violent world and responded with violence. That makes people uneasy, especially those who prefer stories of resistance that feel cleaner, softer, or easier to celebrate. But history is not always clean. The enslaved did not live clean, peaceful lives. They lived under whips, threats, auctions, and forced labor. To judge their responses without fully facing the world they endured is to misunderstand them. Nat Turner should not be studied only as a rebel with a weapon. He should be studied as a human being shaped by spiritual conviction, social terror, historical injustice, and the unbearable pressure of a system that treated his people as livestock. When you see him that way, the question changes. Instead of asking only why he turned to revolt, you begin asking how many others felt what he felt, but never had the chance, means, or support to act. You begin to see that slavery produced resistance as naturally as fire produces smoke. Every attempt to control enslaved people also created new reasons for them to resist. Some resisted by escaping, some resisted by learning to read, some resisted by preserving family, culture, and dignity in a world built to strip those things away. And some, like Nat Turner, resisted through direct confrontation. His story matters because it reminds us that freedom has never been given willingly by systems built on domination. It has had to be demanded, pursued, protected, and sometimes fought for at terrible cost. Turner knew that cost. He accepted that he might die, and still he moved. That is what makes his story unforgettable. He risked everything because he believed that if he did nothing, then slavery would continue devouring generations yet unborn. He was not only thinking of his own suffering, he was confronting a machine that would keep grinding forward unless someone dared to strike it. And even though his rebellion was crushed, the fear it caused and the truth it exposed helped deepen the national crisis over slavery. In that sense, Nat Turner's revolt became part of the road that eventually led to a larger reckoning in America. His life asks a hard question that still echoes today. What does a human being do when every legal, peaceful, and accepted path to freedom has been blocked? That is not just a question about the past. It is a question about power, justice, and oppression in every age. And maybe that is why Nat Turner continues to live in history long after the plantation world that produced him has collapsed. He stands as a reminder that people can be pushed only so far before they decide that the risk of resistance is smaller than the pain of submission. He reminds us that freedom is not always born in comfort. Sometimes it is born in fire, in fear, in faith, and in the refusal to accept a lie any longer. Nat Turner risked everything because he had already seen what slavery did to the body, the family, the spirit, and the future. He understood that if no one resisted, then the chains would simply keep passing from parent to child, generation after generation. So he chose to become dangerous to the system that called him property. And in doing so, he became something slavery could never truly own, a man whose name would survive as a symbol of rebellion, sacrifice, and the terrifying, unstoppable hunger for freedom. Even now, nearly 2 centuries later, Nat Turner's name still carries a kind of heat that many other historical figures do not. Later, Nat Turner's name still carries a kind of heat that many other historical figures do not, because he forces people to face the uncomfortable truth that oppression does not simply create suffering, it also creates explosions. Slaveholders wanted obedience, but what they were really manufacturing, year after year, was pressure. Every whipping, every child sold away, every woman abused, every prayer mocked, every dream crushed, added another layer to that pressure until men like Nat Turner began to see revolt not as madness, but as a final answer to a life designed to deny their humanity. That is why his story should never be reduced to a single event in August 1831. To do that is to miss the deeper meaning of his life. Nat Turner was the result of a system that believed it could dominate people completely and forever. Yet history keeps proving that no system, no matter how brutal, can fully erase the human desire to be free. That desire may be delayed, beaten down, silenced for a season, but it does not die easily. In Nat Turner, that desire took the shape of a man who believed he had a mission larger than himself. He was not fighting only for his own body. He was pushing back against an entire world that had been built on the suffering of black people. And perhaps that is why his rebellion still speaks to so many people today, because even though the legal institution of slavery ended, the struggle over memory, justice, and human worth did not end with it. The legacy of slavery stayed behind in the laws, in the economy, in the culture, and in the racial fears that continued long after emancipation. So when we talk about Nat Turner, we are not just talking about one enslaved preacher in Virginia. We are talking about the larger question of what happens when a society builds itself on dehumanization and then acts shocked when the dehumanized resist. Turner's rebellion exposed not only the cruelty of slavery, but also the hypocrisy of those who benefited from it, while calling themselves civilized and Christian. They went to church on Sunday and returned to plantations where human beings were beaten, sold, and worked like machines. Nat Turner understood that contradiction, and in his own mind, he saw himself as confronting it with the language he knew best, the language of divine judgment. He believed slavery was not just socially wrong, but spiritually corrupt. He believed America had built a sinful order, and that judgment would eventually come upon it. Whether one agrees with his interpretation or not, that belief gave him extraordinary boldness. It allowed him to see beyond the plantation, beyond the whip, beyond the immediate terror of punishment, and to imagine that history itself could be interrupted by the actions of enslaved people. That imagination is powerful. Every major change in history begins when someone dares to imagine that the present order is not permanent. Nat Turner imagined that slavery could be broken, and even though he did not live to see its collapse, he became part of the long chain of resistance that made that collapse inevitable. His life also challenges the way history is often taught. Too often, slavery is presented in schools and public memory as a tragic but distant institution, something sad that happened long ago and then ended neatly. But Nat Turner's story refuses neatness. It forces us to look at slavery as a system of daily terror, and to understand that enslaved people were not simply acted upon, they acted too. They made choices, formed strategies, protected one another, and sometimes rose up in ways that changed the political and emotional climate of the entire country. Turner was one of those people. He reminds us that the enslaved were not voiceless just because power tried to silence them. They had voices, and sometimes those voices came through sermons, songs, stories, coded messages, escape plans, and revolts. That is why remembering him matters. Not because we must romanticize violence, but because we must refuse to flatten history into something harmless. Nat Turner is dangerous history, and dangerous history is often the most honest kind. It forces a nation to confront the things it would rather forget. It tears open the polished story and shows the wound underneath. For a YouTube audience today, especially young people trying to understand the real America behind the myths, Nat Turner's life offers a powerful lesson. Freedom has never been cheap. It has always been a name in the eyes of those who would call him criminal rather than human. But he moved anyway. That is the heart of his story. He chose action over silence in a world that depended on his silence to survive. And that choice, however controversial, is why he still stands in history as one of the most unforgettable figures of American slavery. He was not free when he began, but he refused to die mentally enslaved. That alone is powerful. There are many people who live under oppression and survive by adapting to it so deeply that they begin to accept it as normal. Nat Turner refused that mental surrender. He believed another reality was possible, and that belief made him dangerous to a nation built on forced submission. In that sense, he was not just rebelling against his enslavers. He was rebelling against the entire idea that one human being could rightfully own another. That idea had been dressed up in law, religion, economics, and tradition. But Turner cut through all of it with the most basic truth of all, that human beings are not property. Once a person truly believes that, slavery becomes intolerable in every form. That is why Nat Turner risked everything for freedom. Not because he was reckless, not because he was bloodthirsty, not because he did not understand the consequences, but because he understood them too well. He understood what it meant to keep living in chains, to watch generations inherit terror, to see no legal road out, and to know that obedience would not save anyone's soul. He made a choice born from pain, faith, fury, and conviction. And whether history praises or condemns him, it cannot erase him. His name remains because the hunger for freedom remains one of the strongest forces in human history. And whenever people try to bury the truth about slavery beneath patriotic myths and soft language, Nat Turner rises again as a reminder that beneath every empire of control, there are always people waiting, watching, and one day, deciding that enough is enough. What makes Nat Turner's story so haunting is that, even after all these years, it still asks America a question that has never fully gone away. What happens when a people are denied justice for so long that resistance becomes the only language left? That is the shadow behind his life and behind the institution that created him. Slavery was not only about unpaid labor or economic power. It was about domination over the human soul. It was designed to crush memory, erase identity, break families, silence thought, and convince the enslaved that resistance was hopeless. Yet Nat Turner stands in history as proof that even the most brutal systems cannot completely conquer the inner life of a human being. Something in him refused to surrender, and that refusal is why his story still burns. He was born in chains, raised under threat, watched by men who believed they owned him, yet somewhere inside he developed a sense of self that slavery could not fully destroy. He believed his life had meaning beyond the plantation, beyond the fields, beyond the rules written by men who profited from black suffering. That belief became the foundation of everything he did. It is easy for modern people to talk casually about courage, but Nat Turner lived in a world where courage had consequences that were immediate, brutal, and often fatal. To challenge slavery was not simply to risk criticism or rejection. It was to risk torture, execution, and the destruction of everyone connected to you. That is what makes his decision so severe. He was not stepping into uncertainty. He was stepping into almost certain death. And still he chose movement over paralysis. That is not a small thing. It reveals the depth of his conviction and the unbearable weight of the world he was trying to break. Many enslaved people dreamed of freedom, but dreams alone do not always become action. What pushed Turner beyond the dream was his conviction that waiting would only allow the evil of slavery to continue growing. He looked around and saw a system that was reproducing itself through law, religion, violence, and profit. Children were being born into bondage. Mothers were losing sons. Husbands were losing wives. Men were being worked until they collapsed. Women were being exploited in ways history often softens or skips. Turner understood that slavery was not standing still. It was expanding itself into the future. And when a system of evil keeps reproducing itself, there comes a point when delay begins to feel like cooperation. That is part of what made his rebellion so explosive. It was not just an attack on slaveholders. It was an attempt to interrupt a machine that seemed unstoppable. Even though his uprising was suppressed, the shock waves continued long after he was gone. White Southerners became even more fearful and defensive, while the rest of the nation was forced to confront a reality it often tried to avoid, that enslaved people were not waiting peacefully for freedom, but were willing, under certain conditions, to fight for it with everything they had. That truth changed the emotional atmosphere of the slavery debate in America. It intensified fear, hardened divisions, and helped make slavery impossible to ignore as merely a regional custom or economic arrangement. Nat Turner helped expose slavery for what it really was, a battlefield over the meaning of humanity itself. And that is why he still matters for anyone trying to understand American history honestly. He reveals that the story of America is not only a story of founding fathers, constitutions, and expansion. It is also a story of people held down by those very systems and still finding ways to push back. Turner belongs to the side of history that official narratives often try to keep at a distance because his existence disrupts comfort. He does not allow slavery to be remembered as something abstract or polite. He drags it back into the realm of blood, terror, desperation, and revolt, which is exactly where it belongs if we are going to tell the truth. And truth matters because memory shapes the future. If a nation remembers slavery only through sanitized language and safe symbols, it will never fully understand the damage that institution caused or the kind of courage it took to oppose it. But if it remembers people like Nat Turner in all their complexity, pain, and fire, Then it has a chance to learn something real about power, resistance, and the cost of freedom. Turner also matters because he challenges a common lie about oppressed people. The lie that they are weak until someone else saves them. His story reminds us that the enslaved were not simply waiting for rescue. They were constantly resisting in visible and invisible ways, and some were willing to stake their entire existence on the possibility of liberation. Nat Turner was one of those people. He was not a side note in the history of slavery. He was one of its loudest alarms. He announced through action that no system of domination is ever fully secure, no matter how permanent it looks. Every empire of control has cracks in it, and those cracks often begin in the minds of the people it tries hardest to crush. Turner became one of those cracks. He became a fracture in the illusion that slavery could continue forever without consequence. That is why even those who hated him could not forget him. He forced the country to see the enslaved not as obedient property, but as dangerous witnesses to the nation's hypocrisy. And once that image entered the American imagination, it could not be fully erased. In the end, Nat Turner risked everything because he had reached a place where freedom was no longer just a wish. It had become a necessity, a command, a burden, and a truth he could not unsee. He knew the danger. He knew the cost. He knew that the world he was confronting was armed with law, money, religion, and violence. But he also knew that all of those things together still could not make slavery morally right. That is the final power of his story. It reminds us that legal systems can be evil, majorities can be wrong, and entire societies can organize themselves around injustice while calling it order. Nat Turner saw through that order. He recognized it as organized sin, and he chose to oppose it with his life. Whether history treats him as prophet, rebel, martyr, or warning, one truth remains impossible to escape. He was a man who decided that change should not be accepted simply because they had become normal. And that is why his name still matters. Because every generation, in one form or another, must answer the same question he answered with fire, fear, and faith. Will we accept the world as it is when it is clearly unjust? Or will we dare to risk something for the freedom and dignity that every human being deserves? In the end, Nat Turner's life forces us to confront one of the hardest truths in all of American history, that freedom is often born in places of unbearable suffering, and that the people history tries hardest to silence are sometimes the very ones who speak the loudest across time. Nat Turner did not leave behind riches, political office, or a peaceful legacy wrapped in comfort. What he left behind was far more unsettling and far more powerful. He left behind a question that still refuses to die. What is a human being supposed to do when every door to justice is nailed shut and every breath is taken under the weight of oppression? That question is what gives his story its lasting power. It is why his name still echoes nearly 200 years later. He was not just a man who lived and died in Virginia. He became a symbol of what happens when faith, rage, pain, and the hunger for dignity all meet in one soul that can no longer endure the lie of slavery. The world he was born into told him he was property, but somewhere deep inside, he knew that no law written by man could erase what God had placed in every human being, worth, spirit, and the right to live free. That belief made him dangerous to a nation built on bondage. It made him a threat, not just because of what he did, but because of what he represented. He represented the truth that the enslaved were never simply passive bodies in chains. They were minds that remembered, hearts that ached, spirits that hoped, and people who understood the full cruelty of the system trying to own them. Nat Turner was one of the clearest reminders that slavery was never stable beneath the surface. It always carried within it the seeds of rebellion, because no people can be denied their humanity forever without something eventually rising in response. And that is why his story must be told honestly, not softened, not hidden, not cleaned up to make the past easier to swallow. The truth is that slavery in America was violent, and resistance to it was born inside that violence. Turner's revolt came out of a world where brutality was normal, where mercy was rare, and where the future for black life was being stolen one generation at a time. He understood that if no one resisted, then the chain would simply continue from parent to child, from one auction block to the next, from one plantation to another, until bondage became the accepted destiny of millions. He refused to accept that destiny. And whether one agrees with every part of his path or not, history cannot deny the force of his refusal. That refusal is what made him unforgettable. That refusal is what turned his name into a warning for oppressors and a symbol for those who study the long, painful road to freedom. Nat Turner reminds us that freedom is not just a political condition. It is something spiritual, something human, something so deeply tied to dignity that people will risk everything rather than live forever without it. His life reminds us that the fight against slavery was not fought only in courtroom speeches or government halls. It was also fought in hidden prayers, in whispered plans, in midnight escapes, in secret literacy, in song, in sermons, in tears, and sometimes in open rebellion. Nat Turner was part of that larger river of resistance, and his chapter in that story remains one of the most intense because it strips away all illusion. It leaves us face to face with the cost of a society built on human ownership and the terrifying power of a person who decides he will no longer cooperate with his own dehumanization. That is why his story still matters today, because every generation has its own version of chains, its own systems that try to define who matters and who does not, who gets dignity and who gets denied it. Nat Turner's life stands as a warning that injustice may survive for a time, but it never creates peace. It creates pressure. It creates memory. It creates resistance. And one day, if left unchecked, it creates revolt. So when we remember Nat Turner, we are not simply looking backward at a tragic chapter in American history. We are being asked to think more deeply about freedom, justice, courage, and the cost of silence. We are being reminded that history is not just made by presidents and generals. It is also made by enslaved men in fields, by women in hiding, by children born into chains, and by those who dared to say no to a system that demanded their submission. Nat Turner said no with his life, and that is why the world still remembers him. And now, as this chapter closes, let his story stay with you, not just as history, but as a warning, a witness, and a fire. Because some stories are not meant to entertain us. Some stories are meant to wake us up. Nat Turner's story is one of them. He risked everything because freedom meant everything, and in that choice, he became one of the most unforgettable names in the long and painful struggle for liberation in America. If this story opened your eyes and you want more powerful, forgotten history told with truth and depth, make sure you subscribe to this channel right now, because there are many more hidden stories they never told you in school. And here, we bring them back to life, one chapter at a time.